Alright, we're about to tie the problem child. What I've got here in the vise is a Daiichi 1160 in a size 14 with two 3/32 tungsten beads. I've got a purple and a red Umpqua Radiant tungsten bead on there. Now you can tie this in a variety of different sizes, and there's also another Daiichi hook, an 1167, that is identical to this, just with a black nickel finish, and either one is acceptable. I'm going to start some red 14-aught Vivus thread just behind that first bead. And I'm going to wrap back to just past the point on the barb. And once I get back there, I'm going to build a little nub of thread, and I'm just going to stack up several turns of thread to make a small bump back here. And this bump, while it does help to separate the biot tails that we're about to put in, it's really just for a little hot spot. So I've just made a small nub there, and I'll bump my thread forward just a few turns to get it out of the way. And then I'm going to put just a light coat of Solarez Bone Dry on top of that thread nub. And you want to make sure that you're just on that thread nub so you don't glue your thread down that you move forward, because we are going to move it back. So I just want to coat that all the way around with a thin coat of Bone Dry. And I'll hit that with my UV lamp. And that just toughens up that thread nub. That'll keep that from fraying later when you're fishing the fly, and makes it just a bit more durable. Also adds a little bit of shininess to it. And now I'll unwind the thread back to the front edge of that nub. And now I'm ready to tie in my biot tails. And what I'm going to use for the tails are two purple turkey biots. And what I've done here is I've opposed the two biots so that they're curving away from each other. And then I'm going to measure them just short of a shank length long. I'm going to tie these in at the bend by putting them on either side of the hook shank and tilting them just slightly toward me. So you can see right here is square, and I'm going to turn them just slightly toward me. And I'll take a turn of thread all the way around, but I really haven't tightened this yet. Now typically I let this happen in my fingers, but I want you to watch here. Once I've got that thread wrap around, as I tighten it, I can square those biots up, and you can sort of tweak them into place a bit. I'm pretty happy there. And then I can tighten those thread wraps coming forward from there. So I've got a nice even split tail just over the top of that nub. If you need to, you can tweak these ends. I think I'm pretty good there. And I'll come forward over those butt ends to just short of that red bead, and I'll trim the butts off. Now I'm going to take a piece of 1/100th Mirage lateral scale, and I'm going to tie this in just up here behind the bead. I'll catch it, draw it down to length, and wrap back over it all the way back to the base of the tail. So nothing fancy here. I want to butt those tails right up to that thread nub. And I'll take that piece of flash and I'll just clip it back here in my material spring so it's out of the way for the time being. Now for the body, what I'll use is, this is Nature Spirit Emergence stubbing. And it's a synthetic mix, a mix of different synthetic fibers in different colors. And I've mixed just a tiny little bit of red eye stub into mine. You can see there's just a few little red highlights, and that's just to sort of match up the tones. I'm going to take a small pinch of this. And I'm going to apply this to the thread as tightly as I can to build a tapered abdomen. I need just a bit more here. So I'm going to twist that on tightly. And then I'll begin to build the abdomen. And what I want to do is make the first turn of dubbing back here at the base of the tail, and then work forward from there, sort of building my taper as I go. You can see I can kind of come forward a couple wraps and back up a few wraps. And I'm going to come pretty well right up to the back of that red bead. And hopefully run out of dubbing just exactly where I want it to. So just a tapered abdomen, nothing special there, a little on the chunky side. And now I'm going to take my piece of tinsel and I'm going to counter wrap this, just because this is a coarser dubbing, and this will help set it out on top of the dubbing. I'm going to counter wrap the Mirage tinsel right up to the back of the bead, and then I'll tie it off there with several tight turns of thread before I clip it. I've got a couple wild hairs over here. We'll just get rid of those just to clean things up a bit. And then I'll come in and I'll whip finish the thread there. And I can clip that out. Now I'm going to prop the hook up just a bit here. And I'll put my fingers between the two beads and shove my fingernails right in so that that red bead jams right up to the front edge of the abdomen. And I've got just the tiniest amount of space between the two beads at the front. I'll take my red thread and start it again right in that space between the two beads. And I want to build a good solid thread base and then trim my tag out. Now the whole idea I had on this fly was to try to use these beautiful Coq de Leon hen feathers to make a collar on a smaller fly. And the technique I came up with sort of led to the development of this pattern. But really this fly is more about the technique than it is about the exact pattern. You can certainly change the colors and mix and match it, but any place you want to use a feather with longer fibers to create a smaller collar, this is a good spot for it. So what I'll do here, first I'm going to build a dubbing loop, and I don't need a very long one, maybe 2 or 3 inches. I'll bring the thread back up between the two beads, cross it over the two legs, and cinch it down. And then I take one of the legs and I'll put it in my material spring. That just keeps the dubbing whirl from twisting my thread and my dubbing loop together while I'm trying to place the hackle fibers. Now there's a sort of a special trick for getting the hackle fibers into the dubbing loop without having to fight with them too much, and you don't need a special tool. You can just use your fingers, and I'll show you that here now. So once we've got our dubbing and hackle fibers lined up, we can pick that clump up off the table like so, and I'm going to remove my dubbing loop from the spring. And I'll place these fibers along with the dubbing in the loop. Now one thing that I'll usually do is I'll come through on the bottom edge here, and you can sort of tap them to square them up a bit. In the case of the two colors here, whatever color you want to be the undercolor of the collar, you should have closest to the hook. So I've lined those up. I'm going to pinch the loop just underneath the fibers, and I'll spin my dubbing whirl. And you don't need a crazy amount of spin here. But let that twist work through your fingers until those fibers start to radiate around the thread. And you can see most of the dubbing that you put in there comes out. It does add a little bit of a highlight and a little bit of density to the core. But essentially what we've just done is created a smaller hackle stem for the feather that we're about to wrap, the feather that we just made. So I'm going to take my dubbing brush and I just sort of run it down the fibers, and that just picks out any of the trapped dubbing or trapped fibers. You can see that sweeps it back as well, much like an old school wet fly collar. And then I use the dubbing whirl itself as my hackle pliers to begin to wrap this collar between the two beads. You can see I'll just fold those fibers back after each turn, and you don't need many, 2 or 3. You can see those barbs come just past the point on the barb. And then I'll tie the loop off. You can see very often it will spin like that as you tighten it down, and that's the twisted thread sort of creeping down inside the recess in the front bead. I'll trim the loop out, just make a few turns there to anchor that in place, and you can see the beauty of that technique, creating that smaller collar with a bigger feather. We've got a 2-color collar with a little bit of highlighted dubbing in there, and you could certainly use a different colored dubbing. To finish the fly off, we're going to add 2 little horns, and this is the same turkey biots that we used for the tail. So I'm going to take 2 purple biots, and the first one I'm going to tie in on the far side, and I tie these flat. The tip is going to come just short of the base of the tail. I'm going to lay it in along the far side of the hook and catch it with a couple of turns. And I'll take the next biot and do the same on the near side, and I want these about the same length. Like so. And again, you can sort of tweak the long ends to line those up. Get a few turns to anchor those. Now one thing that I found, anytime you're tying biots in, it's very easy. If I cut these off right now, you'll be tying the fly on the river, and when you go to tighten your knot down, you'll pull those biots out because they're so slick. So what I've been doing is folding these butt ends back and catching them with a turn of thread on each side, just so we've got a fold in there to anchor that down. Then I can trim those butt ends out right up close. Just a more secure way to tie those in. And then our last step is just going to be a little tiny pinch of that same dubbing to build our collar behind the bead. I like to overdo this just a slight amount because I'm going to brush it out. So I'm just using this to cover that thread collar. And I'll whip finish my thread and let it slide off the back edge of that purple bead and tuck in underneath that dubbing. Now here's a slick way to put some resin on those wraps. I'm going to take that working thread and just put a bit of bone dry on it, just right up here close to the hook. And I'll make 2 or 3 turns just to let that resin get on the thread, and then I can unwind and I can trim that thread out. So I just used the thread to apply the bone dry to those thread wraps underneath. That was after the whip finish. It just makes for a very clean application of the bone dry resin. And you can come in and, depending on how shaggy you want your dubbing, you can pick it out with your dubbing brush. Seems my dubbing brush has got more loose fibers than the fly, but we'll pick that out a bit. And we've got the problem child. This fly is just sort of a simple attractor pattern. Obviously it's got it's reminiscent of a prince nymph, which in itself is a great attractor pattern. This gives you a little bit more leeway as far as color variations go, and the 2 beads make it a great dropper fly. It's very heavy. It stays down. Typically tie it in size 14 and 16. I have tied it as big as a size 8 though for much larger stones. But really the whole idea was being able to use those beautiful Coq de Leon hen feathers that are so nice and so webby, but unfortunately on the big side for most of our trout flies. By using that dubbing loop technique, we can make those fibers into a much smaller collar and put them to use on our regular size trout stuff. I hope you like the technique. I hope you like the fly. Tie some up. It has really been fun to fish. Very simple. Not a whole lot of new technique other than how we apply the dubbing fibers into the loop along with the hackle. But give that a try. Play with it a little bit. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next month.